Hey, Juno News. Welcome back to another episode of Not Sorry with Alexander Brown. I'm your host, Alexander Brown. I'm the director of the National Citizens Coalition. I am a writer, campaigner, sort of jack of all trades communicator. Thrilled to have you back here. Thrilled to be a part of this audience. If you have not taken advantage of our exclusive offer, go to junonews.com/notsorry for 20% off. Should have appeared where I was pointing right there, the nice button for you. We are thrilled this week to have Matt Spoke of Project Ontario on the episode. Matt is a conservative thought leader solving for the housing crisis. He's a developer and a serial entrepreneur, works with the Canada Strong and Free Network, and he is putting together, a great movement and a great project to hold the Ford Conservatives to account, who have been, let's be honest, a disappointment to many. And Project Ontario points out that when Conservatives lose their principles, Ontario loses its way. Let's change course. Because if Ontario were an American state, it would rank as the third poorest. Ontario's GDP per capita now trails every G7 country except Italy. And a decade of flat productivity growth ranks it last among Canada's provinces, routinely now seen as Canada's sort of sick man economically. Not getting much better. Ford is, a heck of a populist, but not always, that the rubber doesn't often meet the road when it comes to policy results. He's great at being relatable. He's great at apologizing for mistakes. He's not so great at governing as a conservative, even as a centrist. There increasingly are very few principles there, and that's disappointing because there are great people in that building, great folks who deserve better. I believe Chris Sims pointed this out well today, who does great work with Juno as well. She's with the CTF, that it's like Doug loves like a sort of scarecrow. Like he's always good at blaming Trump or leaning on the Bank of Canada or blaming somebody else when, we still see that Ontario is like the largest sub-sovereign debt, when that cozy relationship with Carney has yet to bear fruit, where youth unemployment is just soaring to record highs. Housing isn't getting better, healthcare isn't getting better, transportation isn't getting better, crime and safety is becoming a massive concern. He's been nowhere on immigration. And so there are some really important issues to talk about and to hold the Ford government to account, to hold, so-called conservatives to account, because I think ordinary families deserve better. I think, this government should stop being some market-tested exercise to always be at 50% in the polls. You could be at 40% in the polls and still do good work and still not lose a bunch of these Ontario Liberal voters and, make Ontario's towns more cohesive and its economy more productive, because it is not. And that's such a darn shame. And so we are thrilled to talk to Matt today. Big fan of his work. It's a really enjoyable chat. And then junonews.com/notsorry for 20% off. Thanks for joining us. Thrilled to welcome on Matt Spoke to the Not Sorry show here on Juno News. Matt is one of the founders of Project Ontario. He is a real estate entrepreneur. His company, Toronto Standard, develops high-rise and mid-rise properties with a primary focus on rental housing. So he's trying to solve for the housing crisis. That is incredibly important. And he's also trying to solve for what maybe is an Ontario conservative crisis of some kind. Matt, welcome on the show. Tell us a little bit more about Project Ontario. When and why did you decide to put something like this together?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. And first of all, I love the shirt. It's
in honor of.
Yeah.
We had a Zoom call once where you wore a Hawaiian shirt. I was jealous. You looked resplendent, and so.
Well, there you go. I should have matched you today, but anyways, it's good to be on. Yeah, I mean the backstory behind Project Ontario is pretty brief. You mentioned I'm involved politically in the Canada Strong and Free Network, which for the most part is a federally focused networking organization of conservatives across the country, unaffiliated to the federal Conservative Party, but often sort of like right alongside the party in terms of like creating space for policy conversations, shifting the Overton window if necessary to make mainstream ideas that we think should be sort of prioritized within the federal sort of arena. And the Canada Strong and Free Network's been around for a long time. I think coming up on 25 years. Originally started by Preston Manning under the name of the Manning Foundation. So I don't want to equate Project Ontario to that. But one thing that I came to realize in my time focusing on federal politics is that there was no equivalent at the provincial level. There was nobody outside of the mechanism of the PC party coming up with policy ideas, holding our party and our government to account if they were straying from a set of principles. Frankly, there was no clear definition of principles as to what did it mean to be a conservative in Ontario. I think for the most part, we've always sort of relied on our political leaders to create that definition for us. And depending on the political leader and the version of the party at any given point in time, that might look a little bit different, right? Like conservatism in Ontario under Bill Davis looked very different than under Mike Harris, and it looks very different under Doug Ford. And I think myself, along with a few others, you included, who have gotten involved, started realizing that there wasn't enough active conversation in Ontario around what should a conservative, quote unquote, small c, policy agenda look like, particularly after seeing a conservative government in office now for coming up on 8 years, right? So it was both the result of frustration, seeing just like not enough getting done, if anything, along the path that we thought the government should be focused, and also just a lack of creative policy thinking. I went, for context, last year. I'm a member of the PC party. I have been, most of my adult life. I went last year to the PC policy convention, thinking, in good faith, I'm going to engage within the party apparatus to have policy conversations, and I realized pretty firsthand that what they call a policy convention is really nothing to do with policy. It's really them just parroting their sort of like predefined talking points. There's no room for members of the party or members of the movement to propose or challenge or criticize. And I think that is ultimately a weakness in the province of Ontario and within the PC party itself. So Project Ontario was sort of born out of that, and now there's a group of us putting ideas on paper and trying to use those to start conversations in or around government, let's say.
Good, and it certainly fills a need, because I think these last few years I've heard from so many people in government behind the scenes who have been really frustrated by what they have seen as an abdication on principles. This is the same group that even through 3 consecutive majorities, strong mandates, kept Sir John A. boarded up for years too long, never should have been boarded up at all. And it's finally sort of come to a head. It's come to a head that if the concern remains among many is that it's congratulations, you keep winning, but this is looking a whole lot like the group before you and the 14 years of Wynne and McGuinty before you. That largest sub-sovereign debt is still a thing. There's still a questionable delivery of services. I've been very outspoken about this. I think if I tried to have gone to that policy convention, I might have been, the door might have been slammed in my face at this point. So I'm on my best behavior today. But I want to, when it comes to what would you say to the argument, and this comes up a lot, to me when I'm talking to people or when I'm talking about this project or holding the Ford Conservatives to account for missing a few things. But they win, Matt. They well, three consecutive, strong majorities, what's the counter to that?
I mean, I think it's a different perspective on what is the role of politics. I mean, some view, and I think this is natural. You get close to sort of the halls of power, and you start to view that your purpose in government is to stay in government. It's to get realected.
Sounds like the federal liberals, Matt.
Yeah, is to always have an eye on the timeline to the next election. And some view politics as a means towards reform, a means towards the implementation of ideas. And I think you need to find a balance there, because I don't want to be naive to think that only ideas and no recognition of the practicality of politics and the reality of sort of facing the electorate on some cycle is real, and political parties need to position themselves in a way that increases their odds of getting elected. But if in your time in office you don't implement things that reflect your ideas, then it sort of brings into question what's the point? What's the point of being in office, right?
Yeah.
I'll say one of my criticisms of this government has been a sense that they follow the polls as opposed to leading them. And what I mean by that is if you were to take, public opinion polling on any major issue facing the province, whether it be healthcare or education or housing or, name your issue, you'd probably find that the PC party is quite closely aligned to public opinion on major issues because they've effectively crafted their political their political strategy around just like being popular to the most number of people. But I think a real leadership in politics is often pulling people towards your ideas. So whether an idea is popular today or not, I think strong political leadership is making the case for an idea that may not be popular and popularizing it, right? So I think we saw this most recently in the lead up to the last federal election with Pierre Poilievre. I think there's a lot of ideas that Pierre Poilievre was talking about that would not have been consensus popular issues 4 years ago that became consensus popular issues in the process of talking about them and convincing people of the merits of these ideas. We don't get that right now out of our government in Ontario. So it tends to just be sort of like the tail wagging the dog, for lack of a better term, and I think that leads to bad outcomes.
It does. I mean, I'm going to reference an Eric Lombardi tweet from today where we even now have sort of small L liberals. Eric is like an urbanist and a planner and
Yep.
a bright young guy. I'm sure you guys have crossed paths where it's even a small L liberal is asking for tax cuts, is asking a sort of a provincial conservative to get out of the way, which tells you that there has been, something's gone awry here. Like that always looking for consensus, but that's not leadership. That is,
well, let alone Eric Lombardi, who I do know well. Doug Ford was out this week telling Mark Carney that we're being taxed to death and the federal government should do something about it, as if he doesn't, in his control, have some levers that he can sort of, and he does this all the time when there's a problem facing the province. It's sort of like pointing the finger to the interest rates that the Bank of Canada is setting or to some federal policy or something else, other than looking at his own sort of set of policy instruments that he could use to make changes. But
yeah, Doug leaning on the Bank of Canada is like particularly worrying. Like the more and more it happens, it's now like a weekly. Actually, I think I know what is best for interest rates. It's like, do you let the TFW program explode? So, oftentimes, let's say housing, which is your field. You are an expert of experts say. You hear a lot about like, oh, the feds should do this, or you hear about the municipalities should do this. Like, I want to hear from you, your expertise. What could the province do right now? Like, what could Doug Ford do right now to help with Ontario's sort of increasingly world-beating housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, what is like at the core of this issue is sort of this question of like jurisdiction, like whose problem is this to solve? And I think what's been convenient for politicians is that there's enough ambiguity that they can all point the finger to each other, right? So if you're Olivia Chow in Toronto, you can point the finger to the province or the feds. If you're the feds, you can point the finger to the province or the cities, and vice versa, right? So, but the reality is that the majority of this issue sits within the authority of the provincial government. I mean, some of that has been delegated down to municipalities. But municipalities are creatures of the province, meaning the province can supersede municipal bylaws, municipal planning acts by decree. I mean, this is not the same thing as the province and the federal government having sort of constitutionally defined jurisdictional boundaries. The city of Toronto, the city of Ottawa, the city of Kingston, London, you name it, where there are issues with our housing market, the province decides to allow them to continue the way they've been operating in a way that, frankly, has created a lot of the issues facing the housing market in Ontario. But they could just as easily decide to pull some of those levers back. I mean, this would have happened most recently in the 1990s when divisions of responsibility between municipalities and the provincial government were sort of redefined. What is a municipal responsibility? What is paid for out of municipal tax revenues versus provincial tax revenues? And the Harris government did a lot to sort of rejig those lines of responsibility. On housing, a lot of this is delegated to the cities to what we call the housing and planning departments of the cities to define what can be built, where it can be built, what taxes should be levied against those or levied against those types of developments. And all of that adds up to a very, very restricted and frankly strangled housing market that can't seem to do anything because there's too many policies restricting or there's too many taxes making these things cost prohibitive. And so one place to go and put pressure is on the cities to say, hey, reverse some of these policies. The reality, though, is that cities and city councilors are beholden to the types of people that vote in municipal elections. And for the most part, these are older homeowners in older and more established neighborhoods, what we've come to call NIMBYs, these not in my backyard sort of constituents. And so it's very difficult for a city councilor, short of, suiciding their political career, to come out very strongly in favor of massive housing reforms. But the province could upload some of these responsibilities back to themselves. They could say, hey, we're going to take some of this back because let's say we have a better sense as to like where growth is happening across the province, what immigration patterns look like, what birth rates are looking like in various parts of the province. And so we can plan more effectively for where growth needs to happen from a housing and infrastructure perspective. So, very simply put, some of this responsibility should be transferred back to the province in terms of how planning is decided. This is things like what can be built where, and things like development charges and other taxes related to housing and development that right now are municipal taxes could also be controlled and dictated by the province.
Yeah, we see like these cheap wins with him where it's, he'll go at an easy target because it polls well. But then like the way you just laid out, like pretty incredibly and like thankful for the insight is that like, no, there are hard levers to pull, but you can pull them. Like he's talked about strong mayor powers and such. It's like, well, you could put in some strong housing powers too, right?
Well, and like, I think it was a week or two ago, he was announcing the extension of one of the subway lines up north to Richmond Hill. And during that press conference, he made the comment that like development charges are just too high. It would be really good if people started looking to reduce development charges. And, all the commentary on this, myself included, was sort of like, Doug, you have the pen. You could change that policy.
What's the meme with Tim Robinson in the hot dog suit? Where we're all looking for the guy who did this.
Yeah, so it's a lot. It's a lot of that. I mean, I do think that there are people within this government that recognize these issues and that would like to reform the things in the right direction, but often are held back by the powers that be. So, I don't want to paint the entire government and the entire PC party with the same brush. I think there are good, principled people within this movement and within this party, but I do think with a lack of a very well-defined and principled agenda, you end up just getting pulled towards wherever the winds are blowing, right? So, and there's nothing really anchoring you towards the types of reform that we think are needed. And, obviously I talk about housing a lot because of my business, but what stands out to me is the most obvious missed opportunity in the province is coming out of COVID and not realizing that for the first time in a generation, there was popular support for massive reforms in education and healthcare because people were sick of having their kids kept at home. They were sick of the completely overwhelmed healthcare system that didn't have enough beds, where surgeries were being canceled and things like that. And you had a moment in time, which is very rare in Canada, where people would have very open to the idea of very significant structural reforms in our healthcare system and our education system. Yeah. And we had a majority conservative government in power that ostensibly should be pro-reform in these two domains, did nothing, right? They effectively did nothing. So, these are very frustrating things when you like care about the outcomes on all these policy files that ultimately add up to the standard of living that we all enjoy or don't enjoy in the province. So,
and I know that's been touched on as well in the hub through the project and some of the contributors. I think of the education piece, and it's there's been all these things just sitting there. And you're right, there are great people in Queen's Park. Like I know MPPs, staffers, consultants. The sort of great wall of GR professionals we have now who are all just kind of pulling their hair out, and they mean well and they want to do well. But when you have these sort of insular, premier's offices, much like the PMO, it's hard to get anything by them because if it's just run as this risk management assessment, you're not gonna cover sort of any conservative principles. Yeah. And so, what does success look like to you? Let's say Project Ontario and its growing list of contributors. I'm one. There are far greater experts than I. Let's do like a perfect day exercise here, Matt. Like it's a couple years from now. You wake up, your family's all happy, the sound of kids playing, coffee's brewing, you're in Ontario. What does it look like?
Well, I'll say like a big part of this in my mind comes down to Doug Ford himself as a leader. When he was elected in 2018, and frankly before he was elected, when he was at City Council and when Rob was still around, I was excited by him, his brand of politician and the Ford brand and the idea that they knew what they stood for and they wouldn't hesitate to, be a bull in a china shop and ruffle feathers and do the right thing regardless of sort of pushback and public opinion. I think that version of Doug Ford is long gone. So, I'd say one positive outcome is that version of Doug Ford finds himself again, and to not frame this as a direct challenge or hostility against his leadership. Let's say he finds his way back to the right path. And I don't think that's going to come from him because I wouldn't consider him in any way, and I don't think he'd consider himself an ideologue of any sort. I don't think he really knows where he stands on major policy files, but he does listen to the people around him. So if we can influence the people around him such that they influence his agenda, then I think that's a very positive outcome. I think that will look like compromising or sacrificing, I should say, popularity for doing the right thing. I think, relying on the fact that you're at 50% in the polls as if that is the measure of success versus what have you accomplished as the measure of success. I'd much rather see him sitting at 40% in the polls, but doing hard things.
That's it, right? And that's been like an argument that I've made before too, where it's like he could still have majority governments if he sat at 40% in the polls, and then everyone would feel happier, safer, rent would be cheaper, things would be a little bit more cohesive, right? Like does it have to be just this absolute low calorie, just sort of empty crowd play? Or like, could we not like keep a little bit of principles while also being popular and boxing out some really lousy opposition that just just can't get out of the blocks?
Well, I think that's, the reality in Ontario is that it's a very different brand of politics than places like Alberta or other parts of the country, right? So I don't think to try to pretend that this is Alberta is the answer. I think you still need to live within the reality of Ontario. Yeah. But I do think that to rely on 50% popularity just means that you're polling within the Liberal Party base, which means you're pushing policies that are favorable and popular within the Liberal Party base, right? So to your answer on like what does life look like, I think life looks like more choice in education. I think life looks like shorter wait times and more access to options in healthcare. I think life looks like better access and lower cost of housing. I think youth unemployment within the broader context of unemployment in general comes down. I think we have safer streets. I don't think these are obscene or, completely dramatic ideas. I think
that shouldn't be too much to ask, right?
Yeah.
That province you just described, I think I might move back to it from British Columbia.
Well, that's the real measure of success. The real measure of success is did we get Alex to come back to Ontario?
That's true. That perfect day, and starts with me sending you like an offensive meme or something, and being like, hey, let's get a beer. But so gee, this project sounds pretty interesting. Do you have any kind of events coming up? Like how can people help grow this pushback, and how can they support Project Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, it's still finding its footing in terms of like what do we want to be when we grow up, let's say. But for in the immediate term, people can check out projectontario.ca. There's a few of our publications in terms of like policy ideas that we've been writing about, the contributors that are involved in the project. You'll find them there at projectontario.ca. We are also about to launch the details of an event that we're going to be hosting at the end of September 30th in Toronto. The venue to be announced, but it'll be quite central and close to Queen's Park, where we're hoping to pull together a group of people, let's say 200 or so people that are enthusiastic about these ideas, enthusiastic about driving change in the policy conversations that surround the Conservative government in Ontario. And then beyond that, it's probably too early to tell. But I do think that the types of people involved in this are very policy minded. So I think a lot of this will bear out in the depth of policy and the prescriptions that we bring forward to say we are not radical in our proposals. We think what we are proposing and bringing to the table is extremely common sense policy. And what we would love to do is engage with people that are within the realm of influence of this government to actually start looking at what we're putting out there and taking it seriously. So we're always looking for supporters. We're looking for people to, one, show up to our event, two, sign up on our website to hear more about what we're up to. And I think it'll evolve over the course of the rest of this year and into 2026. But that's sort of what we have in front of us right now.
All right, you heard it there, folks. If you share our alarm, head to projectontario.ca. Matt Spoke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Alex. This was fun.
Thank you for joining us today, folks, for another episode of Not Sorry. Before I go, I want you to take advantage of this great deal. I know a guy. He can hook you up. It's me. junonews.com/notsorry for 20% off. Thank you for subscribing to Juno News, enjoying the show. We'll see you next week.